During the impeachment saga, the Founding Fathers, they've become a huge part of the debate. Here a small sample of what some lawmakers are saying about them.
As George Washington, our nation's patriot, under whose gaze we stand today, warned, history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government.
Benjamin Franklin cautioned when asked what he had given us, a republic if you can keep it. Today we take a step further toward losing the republic that our Founding Fathers envisioned by engaging in activity that they specifically warned against, the misuse of the constitutional power of impeachment for one party's political gain.
So you just heard from Democrats and a Republican from both sides using the Founding Fathers to make their respective argument. In fact, both Adam Schiff and Mitch McConnell, guys who don't agree on much, they quoted Hamilton to make their points. Plus, 700 historians wrote an open letter supporting impeachment, and they also mentioned Hamilton several times, including this quote. The president's offenses, including his dereliction in protecting the integrity of the 2020 election from Russian disinformation and renewed interference, aroused once again the framers' most profound fears that the powerful members of government would become, in Hamilton's words, the mercenary instruments of foreign corruption. My next guest, one of the historians who penned that letter, Rick Shenkman. He's founder of George Washington University's History News Network. Rick, thank you so much. And I would look forward to our conversation because, first off, before we try and divine both the intent and the concerns of the framers, it is amazing the foresight these guys had at the birth of a nation. And the mechanisms they had the thought to put in place here when they had no rules, basically, they had to go from scratch. But they knew what they were afraid of, seemingly, and they knew that we needed co-equal branches of government here and some checks and balances.
Well, they actually weren't going just from scratch. They were borrowing from the example of what had already been tried in the separate states, and also, of course, going all the way back to England. And the only interesting part is that England was abandoning the practice of impeachment at just the moment that the Founding Fathers decided it would be useful for our government.
What were the fears that caused the Founding Fathers to not just mention impeachment and not just mention it for bribery and treason, but to also put in the category of high crimes and misdemeanors and specifically outline concerns about foreign involvement in our elections?
Yeah, well, several of the Founding Fathers, James Madison in particular, drew particular attention to the problem of foreign interference. And they had very good reason to be worried about this because the United States back then, of course, was a very weak country. It was a brand new country. And what they were afraid of was that Britain and France and maybe Spain, not Russia at that time, would actually try to interfere with our domestic politics. And no sooner had George Washington taken the oath of office than France began trying to actually interfere in our domestic affairs. They sent over a diplomat called Citizen Genet, and he was getting involved in our local elections and trying to really impact congressional legislation. And so they were right to be very, very concerned about it.
As mentioned before, the Alexander Hamilton has become a recurring name here with both sides using his words to attempt to augment their arguments. From your knowledge of history and what concerns both Hamilton articulated and what he thought was necessary for the Republican, for a democracy to really survive, if he looked at the current situation, the tribalism in our politics, and frankly, a president who repeatedly says, that the law does not apply to him, what do you think the reaction of Hamilton would be if he could have been a fly on the wall this week in Washington?
Well, Hamilton, of course, has been cited now by both the Republicans and the Democrats because he had a warning about partisan impeachments. So that sounds very, very relevant. Well, if you're a Democrat and you look at the Republican monolithic response to Trump's impeachment, you'd say, hey, it's a very partisan problem here. We Democrats are paying attention to the facts and the Republicans are only being partisan. And the Republicans flip that and they say, well, the fact that the Democrats couldn't get a single Republican to vote for impeachment proves that they're the ones being partisan. So it makes Hamilton perfect as someone who can be cited by both parties.
Rick, as we talk about Alexander Hamilton and his relevance to today, there was one moment in particular, the closing argument, if you will, that we heard from Adam Schiff, where he quotes Hamilton directly, and it's almost as if Hamilton was a man in the room in Congress today.
When a man, unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, possessed of considerable talents, having the advantage of military habits, despotic in his ordinary demeanor, known to have scoffed in private at the principles of liberty, when such a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the government, the general government, and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall in with all the nonsense of the zealots of the day, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. These are the words of Alexander Hamilton, written in 1792. Could we find a more perfect description of the present danger emanating from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Rick, the prescience of Hamilton a couple centuries ago to come to today and see the assault on truth that's going forward here, the abuse of power, et cetera, it's amazing.
Well, I thought that Adam Schiff gave America a tremendous lesson in civics. Every single time he would sum up after they were having the hearings each day in the Intelligence Committee, he would sum up what had happened. And each of those statements, to my mind as a historian, I was sitting in the audience cheering because it was like, wow, he really paid attention to history, because each time he would summarize the evidence and try to put it into some kind of historical context, which is, of course, what historians try to do. I think the big problem here has been that one side has been trying to deal with the facts and the other side has been trying to ignore the facts because the facts have been going against them so badly. And that has left the country feeling somewhat confused.
Rick, finally, you mentioned with history, obviously, it's the long view, and you suggested that we, as the public, should sit back and take a breath. To that end, what if at the end of this, as expected, the Senate will not only not convict the president, but it'll be on a party line vote? Will we be codifying basically that you can bring foreign involvement apparently on multiple occasions? I mean, go back to the 26 campaign and then obviously where we are right now and possibly again in 2020, that somehow it's okay and somehow the subjugation of the legislative branch to a president's whims, does that become our new normal? Just like facts seemingly, are a thing of the past. How should we look at it in the here and now and then also through the prism of history?
Well, of course, the Democrats have been making that argument, which is why they went ahead and impeached Trump in the House. And I think the very fact that he has now been impeached for this conduct means that subsequent presidents are going to be very wary about trying to get foreign powers to interfere in our elections, because nobody wants to have the big letter I placed on their historical record. At the same time, because he will have been acquitted in the Senate, because they're not going to be able to get 2/3 of a vote unless some breaking news story comes out in the next couple of weeks before the trial and suddenly blows this thing into all smithereens, and the Republicans decide that they have to convict Trump. I think that there is this problem of the Senate almost saying basically what Trump did was okay. But I don't think that any future president, once the House impeached Trump on this, is going to just hither and thither say, oh, it's okay. They're not going to be able to make that argument.
I found myself, Rick, saying, well, we're not going to have this again. I remember after the Mueller report, never imagined the president would have re-engaged another foreign country to try and impact the election. He did that a second time, and I never thought he wouldn't be called to the carpet for it. We'll see what happens in the Senate. But, Rick, very interesting walk through history with you. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, when we come back, we debate the Democratic debate. Who won, who lost, and will it move the needle?